God is in control. At least that's what people of faith often say in difficult or anxious times. We always say that God is almighty, omnipotent, all-powerful. That means that God is in control, right? Lucky for us, the Bible is full of stories about power and control. One is of the ancient Hebrew people noticing that their unique form of government, which is just not having a king, has still managed to become corrupt, and fearful that their very carefully crafted world is in danger of spinning out of control. A kind of mob mentality takes over, and the purposefully non-monarchical people begin demanding to have a king placed over them. They start recruiting people for the job who they believe will be able to bring the chaotic powers and corrupt persons of the world to heel, and the mob eventually gets its way. Israel does become a monarchy, but only against the protest of its most faithful leaders and even of God's self. When the prophet Samuel finally succumbs to the demands, it's because God instructs him, comply with the people's request. They haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. But give them a clear warning, telling them how the king will rule them. In another story, a king named Herod learns of the birth of an apparent rival to his throne. The king uses all the power at his disposal to preserve his control, even massacring countless innocent children, out of fear that one of them one day might depose him. It is interesting that in neither of these biblical stories does God step in and take control of world events, even as they blatantly and destructively oppose God's desires. God doesn't intercede to stop Herod's violence. God doesn't employ what would be a rightful use of power to put down a challenge to divine sovereignty. We may think that God should have taken control in one or both of these instances, but God clearly thought otherwise. These days, I suspect it appears to most of us that God is again deferring at a time we believe would be right for God to take control. As the coronavirus spreads rapidly around the globe, many are asking the familiar question, if God is really powerful and good, why doesn't God put a stop to all this suffering? Well, at least in our two biblical stories, control really isn't God's MO. Instead, it is humans who desire and defend the power to control, and it is God who warns against such desire. In the first story, rather than squash the rebellion, God simply continues to lovingly accept the people even as they reject God. And in the second, rather than, say, killing Herod to stop a greater violence, God simply persists, manifesting all of God's loving acceptance in a living, breathing person who will persist not in controlling the world, but in loving it, all the way to his death on the cross. So what if we've been wrong about God being in control? Not about God being powerful, but about how God uses power, and therefore how all power is rightly used. What if controlling power that brings the world to heel is actually a recipe for disaster, while the power that brings healing to a hurting world is persistent, self-giving, other-accepting love? For the next 5 weeks, as our carefully crafted world continues to spin beyond our control, we'll examine the ways in which humans relate to power and control and to the God who seems far more ready than we to give them up. We'll see you Tuesday night at 8 p.m. on Zoom for a service of Word and Table. Peace be with you, friends.